The story of the Radium Girls begins in the early 20th century, in the United States, during a time of rapid industrial growth and scientific enthusiasm. Radium, a newly discovered element by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898, captured the imagination of the public. Its glowing, mysterious properties were seen as miraculous, even magical. Companies across America, eager to capitalize on its popularity, began incorporating radium into products ranging from luminous paints to health tonics and cosmetics. Among these enterprises were watch dial factories, where young women, often in their late teens or early 20s, were employed to paint the numerals on watch faces with a luminescent radium-based paint. The jobs promised steady wages at a time when employment opportunities for women were limited. Workers were frequently told that radium was harmless, and some supervisors even encouraged them to point their paintbrushes with their lips to create a fine tip, believing it would increase productivity. This practice, known as lip pointing, would ultimately prove to be fatal. The workers, referred to in media reports as the Radium Girls, came from modest backgrounds. Many were recent high school graduates, looking for steady employment in an era when women were just beginning to enter the workforce in significant numbers. The factories where they worked were bustling with activity, the clatter of machinery, the scent of solvents and paints, and the sight of hundreds of glowing dials under dim lights. The glow of the radium paint was mesmerizing, almost enchanting, but it masked the invisible dangers within. At first, the symptoms of radium exposure were subtle. The women experienced fatigue, minor aches, and dental issues, which were often dismissed as ordinary workplace ailments or minor illnesses. Doctors, lacking knowledge about radium's long-term effects, could not immediately identify the cause. Some women began noticing their gums bleeding or teeth loosening. This was often the first visible sign of the creeping poison within their bodies. Despite these warning signs, factory supervisors and company physicians assured them that the pain was temporary, that their bodies would adjust, and that they could continue working safely. The companies producing radium paints were well aware of the risks. Internal documents from several radium manufacturers revealed that management understood the potential for radium to cause severe health problems, including anemia, bone fractures, and cancer. Yet, the pursuit of profit outweighed concern for the workers' welfare. Safety measures were minimal or non-existent. Protective clothing was rarely provided, ventilation systems were inadequate, and exposure limits were ignored. Workers were instructed to use radium powders without masks or gloves, often handling concentrated quantities for hours each day. By the mid-1920s, the toll of radium exposure began to manifest in more severe ways. Women who had once been energetic and full of life found themselves debilitated by excruciating bone pain, particularly in the jaw, a condition that would later be termed radium jaw. Some suffered spontaneous fractures, others developed anemia, neurological issues, and tumors. The glow that had once seemed magical now represented a slow and invisible death. Friends and family watched helplessly as these women, in the prime of their lives, deteriorated physically and emotionally. Attempts to seek medical advice were met with confusion and disbelief. Many doctors, unfamiliar with radium poisoning, dismissed the symptoms as psychosomatic or attributed them to other diseases. Women were often labeled as hypochondriacs or exaggerating their ailments. Their suffering was compounded by social and economic pressures. Leaving their jobs meant losing income, which many could not afford, and pursuing legal action against powerful corporations was daunting. The societal view of women in the workplace further hindered their credibility. Their voices were not given weight, and their pain was trivialized by the very society that had employed them. Amid this growing crisis, a few women began to recognize the pattern of illness and death around them. They noticed that coworkers who had also handled radium were experiencing similar symptoms. One by one, they began to connect their suffering to the mysterious glowing substance they had worked with daily. The realization that their employers had knowingly endangered their lives sparked both fear and outrage. Some women tried to leave the factories, but the economic realities of the 1920s made it difficult. The country was still recovering from World War I, and the Great Depression loomed just a few years ahead, creating an environment where employment was precious and labor rights were minimal. The narrative of the Radium Girls is also a story of scientific misunderstanding and ignorance. At the time, radium was widely believed to have health-promoting properties. It was marketed in patent medicines as a cure for everything from arthritis to impotence. The medical community, captivated by the novelty of radioactivity, underestimated the element's long-term dangers. The lack of regulatory oversight meant that companies could exploit radium without accountability. It was a period when industrial expansion outpaced scientific understanding and workers paid the highest price. Despite these challenges, some women began to document their symptoms, seeking medical tests that could confirm radium poisoning. Blood tests and X-rays, rudimentary by modern standards, started to reveal the accumulation of radioactive material in their bones. These findings were met with skepticism from both doctors and company officials, who continued to deny responsibility. Companies feared public backlash and financial loss more than they feared the health consequences to their employees. The Radium Girls, however, were resolute. They began to share their stories with the press, bringing national attention to their plight. Their fight for recognition and justice was arduous. Legal battles ensued, pitting the women against some of the wealthiest and most influential corporations of the time. Lawyers argued over scientific evidence, attempting to establish a causal link between radium exposure and the women's illnesses. The companies employed their own experts to discredit the victims, claiming that the women had pre-existing conditions or that radium exposure was harmless in the quantities handled. The courtroom became a battleground of knowledge, deception, and moral responsibility. Meanwhile, the human cost continued to mount. The suffering of the Radium Girls was not limited to physical pain. Many endured social isolation, financial strain, and emotional trauma. Families watched daughters, sisters, and wives decline, powerless to intervene. Some women became bedridden, unable to care for themselves, while others faced the indignity of having their teeth extracted or limbs amputated to manage infections caused by bone decay. Their stories revealed a stark reality. The intersection of gender, labor, and scientific exploitation created a perfect storm of injustice. Public awareness began to grow as newspapers published harrowing accounts of the women's experiences. The media, initially skeptical, could no longer ignore the mounting evidence of a systemic problem. Headlines described glowing girls whose radiance had turned deadly. Photographs showed young women in hospital beds, their skeletal frames betraying the effects of prolonged exposure. Letters from concerned citizens poured in, offering sympathy and outrage. The narrative captured the imagination of the nation, not only as a tale of scientific tragedy, but also as a social awakening to the responsibilities of industry and government. Scientific research into radium poisoning accelerated as a result of the Radium Girls' plight. Laboratories began studying the effects of radioactivity on human tissue, uncovering the mechanisms by which radium accumulates in bones and disrupts cellular processes. The findings were groundbreaking, forming the foundation for modern understanding of radioactive exposure and occupational safety. The sacrifices of these women, many of whom would never recover, contributed to the establishment of regulations governing radioactive substances, protecting future generations from similar fates. Yet, during their struggle, the Radium Girls faced enormous resistance. Factory owners used tactics ranging from intimidation to outright falsification of records. Workers were threatened with job loss, eviction, and public vilification. Company doctors continued to assert that radium was safe, attempting to reassure both employees and the public. The women's persistence in the face of such opposition was remarkable. They organized, collaborated with sympathetic scientists and journalists, and sought legal redress, determined to hold the corporations accountable. The case of the Radium Girls would eventually lead to significant legal precedents. In 1928, a landmark lawsuit against the United States Radium Corporation concluded with settlements for the surviving women, although many had already succumbed to their illnesses. The legal outcomes forced companies to acknowledge the hazards of radium, implement safety protocols, and compensate victims. Beyond compensation, the case became a catalyst for labor reform, influencing occupational safety standards and the development of regulatory agencies in the United States. But the story of the Radium Girls is more than a tale of legal battles and scientific discovery. It is a human story of courage, resilience, and tragedy. These women, who had been lured by promises of good wages and steady employment, became pioneers of workplace safety advocacy, often at the expense of their own lives. They endured unimaginable pain and indignity, yet their voices echoed through history, compelling society to confront the ethical responsibilities of industry and science. Even today, the legacy of the Radium Girls endures. Their struggle is remembered not only in scientific literature and labor history, but also in popular culture as a cautionary tale of corporate negligence and the human cost of industrial progress. Monuments and memorials honor their courage, and their experiences continue to inform discussions about workplace safety, gender equality, and ethical accountability. The glow of radium, once considered miraculous, remains a symbol of both wonder and warning. As the first part of their story concludes, it is clear that the Radium Girls were not merely victims of circumstance. They were witnesses to a time when innovation outpaced morality, when the allure of progress blinded both corporations and society to the hidden dangers faced by ordinary workers. Their suffering, perseverance, and ultimate fight for justice illustrate the profound impact that determined individuals can have in challenging systemic injustice. The tale of the Radium Girls is a stark reminder of the intersection of science, industry, and human vulnerability. A story as compelling as it is tragic, and one whose lessons remain relevant a century later. As the public began to hear the harrowing accounts of the Radium Girls, the focus shifted toward accountability and justice. By the late 1920s, the magnitude of the health crisis had become undeniable. Survivors and their families, many of whom had watched their loved ones deteriorate, were determined to challenge the corporations responsible. The fight for recognition, compensation, and reform was arduous, complicated by legal technicalities, corporate influence, and the prevailing societal norms that often dismissed women's suffering. One of the most pivotal legal battles unfolded against the United States Radium Corporation. The women, many of whom had endured years of pain, tooth loss, bone decay, and terminal illnesses, were now confronting a powerful adversary. Their case required rigorous documentation of radium's effects, a scientific challenge in an era when understanding of radioactivity's dangers was still developing. Physicians who supported the women conducted painstaking research, performing X-rays that revealed radium lodged in their bones and observing the characteristic lesions associated with radium-induced anemia and necrosis. These findings were critical in establishing a direct link between workplace exposure and illness. The legal proceedings were dramatic and emotionally charged. The companies, aware of the implications of admitting liability, sought to downplay the dangers of radium. Expert witnesses hired by the corporations argued that the women's illnesses could be attributed to pre-existing conditions, poor nutrition, or general frailty. They challenged the scientific methodologies used to detect radium in the human body and questioned whether the symptoms could indeed be caused by the substance. Courtrooms were filled with tense exchanges as the women, many bedridden or visibly weakened, gave testimony about their suffering, their work conditions, and the deception by company officials. Throughout these trials, the Radium Girls demonstrated remarkable courage. They recounted in painstaking detail the hours spent at their workstations, the process of lip-pointing the brushes, the glowing dials that captivated them, and the gradual onset of pain. Their stories humanized the abstract scientific debates, putting faces and voices to what might otherwise have been seen as statistics or medical curiosities. Photographs circulated in newspapers showing skeletal frames, hollow eyes, and mouths where teeth had been lost to radium-induced decay. The public was confronted not just with scientific evidence, but with undeniable human tragedy. Media coverage played a crucial role in shaping public opinion. Journalists began to report extensively on the conditions faced by the workers and the apparent negligence of the corporations. The narrative emphasized the young age of the victims, the preventable nature of their suffering, and the intransigence of powerful industrial interests. Letters and editorials from concerned citizens amplified the pressure, demanding that justice be served. The stories of the Radium Girls became emblematic of the broader struggle for workers' rights, gender equity in the workplace, and the moral obligations of corporations. The outcome of the lawsuits, while not completely satisfying in every respect, marked a turning point in labor law and occupational health regulations. In 1928, several women reached settlements with the United States Radium Corporation. The legal agreements included monetary compensation for medical expenses, loss of income, and recognition of the harm caused by radium exposure. Yet, many of the women had already succumbed to their illnesses, their lives cut tragically short. The settlements, though significant, could never fully atone for the years of suffering, the lost youth, or the ultimate deaths of the victims. Beyond the courtroom, the case of the Radium Girls had profound implications for workplace safety standards. The publicity and scientific research it generated contributed directly to the establishment of regulations governing exposure to radioactive substances. The U.S. government began implementing stricter oversight of industrial practices, mandating protective equipment, monitoring employee health, and setting exposure limits. Laboratories and factories handling radioactive materials were required to implement rigorous safety protocols, a legacy of the courage and suffering of these women. The Radium Girls' story also intersected with broader social and cultural dynamics. In the early 20th century, women were often marginalized in professional settings, particularly in scientific or industrial environments. Their complaints were dismissed not only because of corporate denial, but also due to gender biases that minimized the experiences of women workers. The Radium Girls challenged these societal norms simply by asserting their right to be heard, to be treated with dignity, and to demand justice. Their fight became an early catalyst for women's labor activism and highlighted the vulnerabilities faced by female workers in male-dominated industrial systems. Despite their courage, the physical toll on the Radium Girls was immense. Many endured prolonged hospitalizations, surgeries to remove necrotic bone, and the agony of terminal illness. The symptoms were relentless. Bone fractures occurred with minimal force, infections were common, and tumors often developed in the jaws, skull, and long bones. Some experienced systemic failures as radium disrupted bone marrow and weakened internal organs. Families were forced to witness the slow and painful decline of daughters, sisters, and wives, often with little recourse for relief. The emotional and psychological burden of these experiences was as devastating as the physical symptoms. Scientific research into radium poisoning, spurred by the women's plight, transformed both medicine and industry. Studies conducted in the aftermath of the Radium Girls lawsuits revealed the long-term retention of radium in human bones, the mechanisms of radiation-induced cancer, and the critical importance of workplace safety protocols. These discoveries laid the groundwork for modern occupational health standards and informed future research into radiation exposure, including nuclear medicine and industrial applications. In essence, the suffering of the Radium Girls catalyzed knowledge that would protect countless workers in subsequent decades. The cultural memory of the Radium Girls continues to resonate. Memorials and exhibitions commemorate their lives, emphasizing both the tragedy they endured and the victories they achieved. Their stories are studied in history, labor, and science curricula, illustrating the consequences of industrial negligence, the importance of ethical responsibility, and the resilience of those who fight for justice. Films, books, and articles recount their experiences, ensuring that the lessons of this dark chapter are not forgotten. The glowing radium that once symbolized wonder became a symbol of caution, reminding society of the hidden costs of technological and scientific advancement. The legacy of the Radium Girls extends beyond regulations and memorials. It is a story of empowerment, illustrating how ordinary individuals, even in the face of overwhelming odds, can challenge injustice. Their determination to confront corporations, assert their rights, and demand recognition transformed public consciousness and reshaped the legal landscape for workers. They revealed the human consequences of industrial greed and scientific hubris, forcing a society to confront ethical responsibilities that extend beyond profit margins. In personal terms, the Radium girls left indelible marks on their families and communities. Survivors often carried physical scars, chronic pain, and psychological trauma, but they also carried the pride of having fought for justice. The bonds formed among these women, forged in shared suffering, became sources of strength as they navigated the trials of legal proceedings and public scrutiny. Letters, diaries, and recollections preserve their voices, providing insight into the emotional dimensions of their struggle. Ultimately, the story of the Radium girls serves as a stark warning about the intersection of science, industry, and human vulnerability. It highlights the dangers of placing profit above safety, the consequences of ignoring empirical evidence, and the moral responsibility owed to workers. Yet, it is also a story of courage, resilience, and the transformative power of collective action. The Radium girls' legacy endures not only in regulatory reforms and scientific knowledge, but also in the broader consciousness of society, reminding future generations of the stakes involved when human health is treated as secondary to industrial ambition. As the second part of this story concludes, the Radium girls emerge not merely as victims, but as pioneers of workplace advocacy and social justice. Their experiences shaped the development of modern occupational health regulations and informed cultural perceptions of industrial responsibility. Though their lives were tragically shortened, their impact continues to resonate, illuminating the costs of progress and the enduring importance of ethical accountability. The tale of the Radium girls remains a testament to human courage, a narrative of sorrow and resilience, and a cautionary chapter in the history of science and industry.